Scott Pilgrim is geek royalty. Whether we are discussing the graphic novel series by Brian Lee O'Malley or the 2010 Edgar Wright live-action adaptation in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Scott Pilgrim is a cult classic that is ubiquitous with nerddom like Dungeons & Dragons and various specialty flavors of Mountain Dew, even though those said specialty flavors of Mountain Dew taste like ass, because I don't care what PepsiCo says, that shit is poison. But regardless, Scott Pilgrim, whether graphic novel or movie, is beloved in geek circles for its comic book and video game style action, fantastical elements where the story also follows video game and comic book logic, enthralling visual art style, witty writing, a lead character in Scott Pilgrim who is very charming despite having critical character flaws where he likes to avoid personal conflicts that he is responsible for, which is very ironic given that he is very capable in a physical conflict. The graphic novels and movie feature an entertaining story revolving around how Scott, in order to win over the women of his literal dreams and Ramona Flowers, must do battle against Ramona's 7 evil exes. And then finally, in terms of the movie by itself, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World had an incredible cast with great leads like Michael Cera as Scott, Mary Elizabeth Winstead as Ramona, and Jason Schwartzman as the head of the League of Evil Exes in Gideon Graves. Then the film also featured now well-known actors before their careers eventually reached their apex, most notably Chris Evans, who in the film was BCA, i.e. before Captain America, as well as Brie Larson and Anna Kendrick. And finally, there were a bunch of other supporting roles that were executed to perfection by the likes of Aubrey Plaza, Mae Whitman, Brandon Routh, Satya Baba, Ellen Wong, Kieran Culkin, Allison Pill, and just so many damn others. Like seriously, everyone in this movie was great. And for that, Scott Pilgrim, whether graphic novel or movie, was fantastic. And while sure, the graphic novel series itself had a niche audience, and the movie itself didn't do too well at the box office upon its original release, Scott Pilgrim remains a beloved property by those in the know and is just a cult hit. It is awesome. And whether you have read the books or seen the movie, or are audience members like myself who have only seen the movie but have admired the graphic novels from afar, the Scott Pilgrim IP just has a lot worth loving. It is a wonderful story. This is why there was excitement for Netflix's recently released Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. After all, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off was anticipated to be an episodic animated adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim graphic novels, and one featuring the voices of many of the actors from Scott Pilgrim vs. the World that would both be done in an art style similar to the source material, as well as being a more fleshed out version of the story compared to the film adaptation, because you know, movies have time constraints, whereas TV is more long form, meaning that a potentially accurate television adaptation could have been very compatible with the Scott Pilgrim IP, given that's the source material told the story through multiple graphic novels. If anything, in the source material, Scott Pilgrim was already a long-form story, something that would have really befit a TV show's inherently episodic storytelling structure. It would have been a sensible match, basically like Peanut Butter and Chocolate, or Bad Dancing at a Grateful Dead concert. A comic book accurate Scott Pilgrim television adaptation just would have been a logical match. And for that reason, with Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, many fans of the original graphic novel were hoping for an accurate adaptation via the medium of animation and television. But with that being said, this isn't what those fans ultimately received, mostly because there was a very significant rug pull at the end of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off's first episode that upends the expectation that this would be an accurate adaptation, meaning that following the events of the first episode, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off becomes its own entity that explores unique narrative, thematic, and character angles much differently than in the source material or even Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And admittedly, many fans that were hoping Scott Pilgrim Takes Off would be an accurate animated adaptation of the source material were pretty miffed. If anything, they were unhappy with the change of direction, which honestly is fair. After all, due to the show's trailer and promotional material that didn't spoil the twist, many fans went into Scott Pilgrim Takes Off with a certain expectation of what the show would be, only for that said show to not be that. Because truly, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is Oppo Shakespeare. And to be fair to them, the fans that were disappointed that they didn't ultimately receive that accurate animated adaptation have valid feelings on the matter. They are understandable. But here is the thing. My counterpoint to that is that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is really damn good. In fact, regardless of what side of this all too important debate you are on, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a high quality show, mostly because it operates as a recontextualization, as an expanded view of Scott Pilgrim's world and characters, as a meta commentary, and as a sequel to both both the source material and its film adaptation. If anything, the show further explores Scott's personal failings, delivers an arc for Ramona so that she is more than just a very interesting love interest, gives the evil exes more screen time to the point of humanizing them, because, you know, calling themselves the evil exes is just good branding after all, makes numerous unpredictable twists and turns that make sense to the series' narrative and artistic style, and has a light tone that is very amusing and lends well to the script's sharp wit and penchant for hilarity, all while still having emotionally resonant storytelling and believably earnest characters that the viewer can easily take with sincerity. And speaking as someone who often can't be taken seriously, I respect that. And for all of these reasons, as well as the great visual art style by Japanese animation studio Science Saru, and the awesome vocal performances of so many of the returning cast from Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a terrific show, and one that easily lives up to the legacy of the original graphic novels and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And while sure, many fans have fair critiques revolving around how Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is not the animated adaptation of the original comic that they anticipated, this doesn't change the fact that the new show is honestly better than a straight-up remake. Because let's be clear here, we, the media-consuming populace, didn't need a new adaptation of the original Scott Pilgrim. After all, we already have excellent versions of this story via the original graphic novel series and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and if anything, a new adaptation would have just felt unnecessary, just like decorative pillows, because I hate that shit, they are worthless. Thus, the fact that we received a great recontextualization and even a kind of sequel to the original property, and one that is co-written and co-run by Ben David Grabinski and Brian Lee O'Malley, i.e. the author of the original graphic novels, which ultimately gives Scott Pilgrim Takes Off an air of authenticity, is just so much more awesome than just yet another adaptation of Scott Pilgrim. And while sure, I still would have watched and even enjoyed a comic-accurate adaptation of the original Scott Pilgrim, mostly because, as stated earlier in this essay, an animated TV rendition of the story could have been a more expansive version of Scott Pilgrim compared to the film adaptation, which had to cut aspects of the narrative and character development out due to runtime and other reasons that would have just been really redundant and been lesser compared to the version of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off that we ultimately received. Because truly, even though some fans may criticize the show for baiting and switching the audience and being false advertising or whatever, that doesn't change the fact that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a wonderful show, and one that proved that there were more avenues to explore within this IP in regards to its character development, emotional arcs, and world building. It doesn't change the fact that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off forged its own narrative in a way that was both unpredictable and exciting. It doesn't change the fact that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off acted as an authentic sequel that we didn't know we'd ever be receiving. And it ultimately does not change the fact that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is really f***ing good.